Hello, this is Alice Formiga of eOrganic, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar on milk fats, What's in it for the Consumer by Jana Kraft and Allison Unger of the University of Vermont. This is the second webinar in a series of 2 webinars about milk fats based on research project funded by NIFA OREI. eOrganic publishes free articles, videos, and webinars about organic farming and research, and you can find all of them on our new website at eorganic.org and on the eOrganic YouTube channel. So I'd like to welcome our 2 presenters today from the University of Vermont, Jana Kraft and Allison Unger. And so without any further ado, I'm going to pass the screen control over to Jana, who will introduce herself and the webinar.
Thank you for inviting us to this webinar. This is very exciting for me because this is actually my very first webinar I'm giving. And although I should be now very used to teaching online, this is still an interesting platform because I unfortunately don't see my audience, and it's so much more fun to see the audience. But welcome everybody. Greetings from Vermont. We actually just skipped our spring season. We had about 2 inches of snow 2 weeks ago, and today we are actually having 93 degrees in Vermont. So very different weather we're having here, and I appreciate everybody attending our webinar. So we entitled our webinar Dairy Fat, What's in it for the consumer. So a different perspective, and I think it's really important to see what's on the consumer side. Before I get into this though, I just want to briefly introduce myself. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Animal and Veterinary Sciences at the University of Vermont, and I also hold a secondary appointment at the Department of Medicine. I was born and raised in Germany, hence my accent. In fact, I was actually born in East Germany, so the running joke in our family is that I'm a collector's item, as our country is actually not existing anymore. About 13 years ago, I came to the United States as a postdoc, and I decided to stay at UVM as I really enjoyed my work there and my colleagues. And my research basically revolves around dairy fat and fatty acids, and particularly in a context of human health and disease prevention. And here I'm especially interested in how we can prevent type 2 diabetes with dairy fats and fatty acids. Yeah, and so we have divided our presentation between me and Allison Unger. She's actually a graduate student in my lab, and she will be introducing herself as well. But we decided to split our presentation into 2 main parts. So I will give you a basic introduction and background on dairy fats and fatty acids, basically in terms of a consumer perspective. And then following my section, Allison is going to present her latest paper she published on the fatty acid content of retail cow's milk in the Northeastern U.S. And then we round up our presentation with a conclusion and take-home message. So let me get started with an introduction on the dairy fat and dairy fatty acids. In the United States, the milk fat content of whole milk is 3.25% with the exception of California. Here actually milk is produced under the Californian standards to contain at least 3.5%. And I'm pointing this out because actually most of the consumers do not know how much fat is in whole milk. And in fact, I'm surveying always my students, and in last semester I had about 111 students in my class. I teach animal nutrition, basics of animal nutrition, and I was surveying them, asking them, how much fat do you think is in whole milk? And it's very surprising the answers I'm getting. I'm getting from 5% to 10%, 50%, and I've gotten even 100%. And you know, when I asked, it's like, why do you think is whole milk so fatty? And they said, well, isn't the name whole implying that? So I'm pointing this out because there's clearly a really important message we have to convey to our consumers. We still have to do a lot of consumer education in terms of what actually whole milk is. And I think actually the beef industry has been doing a pretty good job on this already by just, advertising 95, 96% fat-free beef. And I think we can do the same thing with our whole milk by just saying whole milk is 97 or 94% fat-free. So similar idea. So this fat content at 3.25% translates into 8 grams of total fat in one serving or one glass of whole milk. So 8 ounces, 8 grams. It's relatively easy to remember. And as you can see here in this diagram, saturated fatty acids are the predominant fatty acid class in dairy fat, accounting for about 70% of the total fatty acids. Of course, all of these are not static, depend very much on the season, how the animals are fed and so on. But nevertheless, saturated fatty acids are the main fatty acid class in whole milk or in dairy fat. This is then followed by monounsaturated fatty acids, accounting for 25% of the total fat. And then lastly, we also have a small amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids, accounting for about 5%. So my students often ask me, it's like, so how is this possible that we see so much saturated fatty acids in whole milk, and yet, the rumens, the dairy cow, is being fed feedstuffs that actually contain a relatively high amount of unsaturated fatty acids, and yet only a very small amount of that is actually finding its way into the milk. And the answer is the bacteria in the rumen. So what the bacteria in the rumen do is they take the unsaturated fatty acids, specifically the polyunsaturated fatty acids from the feed, and they actually convert them to saturated fatty acids in a series of events called biohydrogenation. And they basically do this because they protect themselves. And they protect themselves because polyunsaturated fatty acids or unsaturated fatty acids are actually harmful to them. So in an environment where there are a lot of unsaturated fatty acids, they can't strive. They can't grow and they can't reproduce. They would basically die. So when they kind of, evolutionarily came up with a clever protective mechanism by converting those unsaturated fatty acids to saturated fatty acids. So hence, we actually have a relatively high amount of saturated fatty acids in our whole milk or dairy products in general. So because the saturated fatty acids are that high in dairy products also are the major contributor to saturated fatty acid intakes in our diet. And that, of course, poses a problem because, as you all know, likely from your physician, from health authorities, or any of the news outlets, we all kind of know that the dietary intake of saturated fatty acids has been strongly linked to cardiovascular disease, also other metabolic diseases, but primarily cardiovascular diseases, and also premature death. So that is actually the reason why a lot of health authorities have been recommending to limit the intake of saturated fatty acids. And by extension, this really hits hard the dairy fat in dairy products. And I want to show you this here. Here I have shown the dietary recommendations from 3 different national health authorities here in the US. We have here the dietary guidelines for Americans, which are published by the USDA. And here on the right side, we have the dietary guidelines from American Diabetes Association. And down here, we have the American Heart Association. And what you can see is that although they all recommend 2 to 3 servings of dairy as part of a healthy diet, they also recommend to actually choose from fat-free and low-fat dairy products. So whole dairy products have not made it into these recommendations. And what's actually even more striking is they have never made it into the recommendations in the United States. And this is what I'm showing you here. This is actually a timeline we have published, and Allison has published just recently in our review about saturated fatty acids in dairy products. And what it shows is it's basically a timeline of the evolution of dietary recommendations, basically with dietary guidelines for Americans, which used to be very briefly the dietary goals in the United States, but we also looked at the Canadian Food Guide, and we looked at the WHO, the World Health Organization, the guidelines. And what's very striking is when you look at 1977, so this is over 40 years ago, you can see from the inception of these guidelines, they always recommended to consume fat-free and low-fat dairy. And you may wonder where this is coming from. This is all basically rooted on the so-called diet heart hypothesis, which is more than 70 years old, and it's kind of based on research that was conducted by Dr. Ansel Keys, who found that saturated fatty acid intake is linked to cardiovascular disease. And this has been kind of implemented into these dietary guidelines. And as you can see all the way through, the last 40 years, it has never really been changed. And when you have a close look at the dietary guidelines from Canada, it's basically the Canadian Food Guide, you can see here not only that they recommend to consume low-fat dairy, but even more so, they actually recommend to replace foods with mostly saturated fats, foods containing mostly unsaturated fats. So this is very clear that here the recommendation is to replace dairy foods, at least if they're containing fats. So that's really worrisome. And then what you can see here on the right side, for the first time in 2018, actually the WHO has also picked up on that, and they basically recommended to consume low-fat dairy. And if you're looking actually at their website right now, they also have a very recent recommendation for COVID-19. And here again, you actually find that they recommend to consume low-fat dairy, which is very surprising. What you can see yet here, and I will be, I'm waiting for this, it will be really important to know, is what are the next dietary guidelines for Americans, because they're coming out by the end of the year. So I'm really curious about this, because the reason for that is I'm curious is that there's more and more emerging evidence that's actually showing that the scientists from like 70 years ago might actually not be completely right about what they found. There's more and more evidence now showing that saturated fatty acids may actually not be linked to coronary heart disease. And what I have compiled here, it's nothing really you need to read. I just want you to understand what I did here. These are 4 different publications. All of them have been published over the last decade. And here the latest one is just about like 1 or 2 months old, from Kang et al. In 2020. And what they did is they performed so-called meta-analyses. And a meta-analysis is a statistical procedure that is being used to combine all results from any independent clinical trial, epidemiological trial, of studies where they have similar like research questions. Like in this case, the research question is, does dietary saturated fatty acids cause coronary heart disease? So they pulled all these studies together, which is what you can actually see here. The first one, 21 studies, 32 studies, 12 studies, and they pull, of course, all of the participants from these studies together too. So with that, you're actually getting a really high power and a good validity of your results. And what all of these have shown, and these again, a lot of studies, lots of participants, and they have shown that actually saturated fatty acids likely are not linked to a coronary heart disease. And moreover, just in the recent few years, there have been several epidemiological studies, but also some clinical trials, and they have actually shown that saturated fats derived from dairy might either be neutral or they are even protective, which is really interesting. They might be protective in terms of cardiometabolic diseases. So, and I personally attribute this that saturated fat is not saturated fats. And I will show you this in just a second. There are so many different fatty acids in milk and so many different saturated fats, and we cannot put them all in one category. So with this being keeping in mind, so we are basically leaving the saturated fats, so they're not bad after all. But what I want to show you is milk fat is not just these three classes. Milk fat is much more. It actually is the most complex fat mixture in nature of all edible fats. It's composed of more than 400 fatty acids, and this is kind of a little snapshot what you can see. This diagram is called a chromatogram. It's from the instrument where we are analyzing the fatty acids from different fats, and as you can see, there are all these little peaks here, and each peak signifies a fatty acid. So there are more than 400 in milk. And just to put this a bit better in context for you, if you are eating, for example, sunflower oil, or you're eating soybean oil, or something similar, peanut oil, those oils, for example, they only have between 25 and 30 different fatty acids. And if you're having tonight a salad with your olive oil, then you're actually having just between 18 and 20 different fatty acids. So there's a lot to dairy fat. And tonight when you're having a glass of milk, or you're eating your butter, just remember there are more than 400 fatty acid molecules hitting your tongue and your stomach, of course. So very interesting, very exciting. Of course, there are only about 12 fatty acids. They are present in milk above 1% of the total fatty acids, so they make up the majority. So many of these 400 ones are really small. But what's interesting about this is that especially these minor fatty acids actually have a lot of biological activity in terms of human health, and I'm going to show you this in a second. So what's also unique is that dairy fat has fatty acids. They are only occurring in dairy and nowhere else, and that makes them so special. So where are they coming from? They're actually coming from the rumen. So the rumen of the dairy cow houses a very dense and very complex community of microbes. We find bacteria, we find so-called protozoa, archaea. These are the ones which make the methane. Then we find fungi, and we also find phages. And the rumen microbes, they live in a kind of a synergistic and dynamic relationship with its host, the dairy cow. I always explain this to my students, that they live like a landlady and tenants together. So the cow is the landlady. She provides nice housing, she provides warmth, she also provides the food. And on the other hand, the rumen microbes, they're the tenants, and they are basically digesting the otherwise indigestible plant matter for the cow and transforming it into energy and other components the cow can actually use. So they're living in a really great relationship. Basically, it's not a one-way, it's a two-way relationship. So of these rumen microbes, we have the bacteria and the protozoa, and they are making up the majority of the rumen microbes. And they also make many of unique bioactive fatty acids. And these unique bioactive fatty acids, they are basically leaving the rumen. They are then absorbed in the gastrointestinal tract into the bloodstream, where they basically travel to the tissues. So they end up in the tissues, you will also find this in your meat, but also they travel to the mammary gland, where they are incorporated into the mammary gland and into the milk. And this is why we find these unique bioactive fatty acids also in our milk and dairy products. So there's a wide variety of these fatty acids in a milk. We have so-called short and medium chain fatty acids. So if you're not very familiar with fatty acids, you can just imagine here, there's a little picture of fatty acids. So you can imagine them like a pearl chain. So, you know, every pearl is like, is a piece of this fatty acid. So when they're fatty acids, they're a shorter pearl chain. And then we have also medium chain fatty acids. So in the short ones, especially the butyric acid, it's very, very short. It's very unique to dairy products, and there have been many studies showing that butyric acid is very useful for human health. Also because they're all very short, they actually provide us with quick and useful energy when our body needs that. Then we have odd chain fatty acids. Usually in nature, we only find even chain fatty acids. So these are these pearl chains. They have usually, the majority has 16 pearls, and but there are also 18. But because of the bacteria, there are a lot of these odd chain fatty acids as well, which are very unique. And then we have branch chain fatty acids. They actually, and you can see this up here, they're different from any other fatty acid because they have a branch at the end of the molecule. And there are a lot of different ones, and all of which are actually produced again by the rumen bacteria. So you can't find this in your vegetable oils or anything else. They're unique to dairy products. And then there's a category I called other fatty acids. So they're like lactanic acid. That's a very typical fatty acid for dairy products. The name vacca is actually Latin and means cow. And, you know, so the name is actually derived from when they found this in butter about like 100 years ago. So very typical fatty acid for dairy products. And then we have romanic acid. Most of you might actually just know it under CLA. What most people don't know is, of course, CLA is an acronym of conjugated linoleic acid, and that's actually a pretty big group of fatty acids. There are about like 56, but the one we have found the most biological activities is romanic acid, and it kind of, the name is originally derived from where they thought it's it's produced, but of course we know now also the mammary gland on the body of the cow can actually make this from bexanic acid. So one thing I want to point out is, so when you look at this closer, is that all of them have a T in their formula, and the T stands for trans, because all of these are trans fatty acids. And I just want to spend 1 or 2 minutes on these, because it's really important to talk about trans fatty acids, because you may know that as of January of this year, the FDA actually mandated that industrially produced trans fatty acids have to be removed from the food chain. So, and this is important because with that, now that we are not having any industrially produced trans fatty acids in our food chain anymore, the trans fatty acids from the dairy will be the sole source of trans fatty acids in our diet. But, and this is why I want to spend a little bit of time on this, trans fatty acids from ruminants are very different from any industrially produced trans fats, like, you know, think of Crisco, for example. So what's important is, first of all, of course, they're naturally occurring. And they're naturally occurring, for example, just go back, CLA is a trans fat. Most people actually don't know that, but they're naturally occurring because they're produced, again, by bacteria in the rumen. They're basically a metabolite produced when bacteria converting this unsaturated fatty acids to saturated fatty acids. So they're just, you know, just a product of metabolism. And in general, they occur in very low amounts in dairy fat, as opposed to what you would find, for example, in Crisco. Here you see, this is a nutrition facts label from whole milk. And I have kind of like cropped this out here, and you can see it states 0 grams of trans fat. This is a little bit misleading though. The amount of trans fats in dairy fat is very low, but based on the nutrition facts, there's the rule that everything that is below 0.5 grams per serving can be declared as 0. So because trans fatty acids are relatively low in dairy fat, you will always find trans fats 0 grams in whole milk. And lastly, I just want to point out there have been numerous studies now conducted in animals or also in humans in clinical trials, and they have found that trans fats derived from ruminants do not appear to have detrimental effects on human health. So moving back to all of our unique bioactive fatty acids that occur in dairy, I've just compiled several it's almost like a review where I looked at different health properties of these. These are pulled, in fact, Allison is going to show you one of our publication we published recently. And it shows you that all of these different fatty acid classes and single fatty acids have different health properties. So one word of caution is that, of course, most of these are derived from studies where a single fatty acid, let's say CLA or a certain branched-chain fatty acid, was fed to either like a cell line or like different animal models such as like rats and mice or pigs, or also they were fed to humans. So it's usually a single fatty acid, a single isolated one. And it's important to recognize that we, of course, don't eat a single fatty acid. But what's interesting is when you look at all these different health benefits, one thing that always is clear is, lowering blood lipid levels, reducing cardiovascular disease. You see this over here too. So it always seems to be, they have all something in common. Same with type 2 diabetes. Here we have improvement of glucose tolerance, reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes. So what slightly happens is when you're consuming dairy products, it's not necessarily like one fatty acid. We don't eat that. We eat like whole foods. We eat different food matrices. So we eat all of these in concert, and likely those work also in concert and also elicit their properties in concert. In fact, right now our lab is conducting a larger clinical trial at the University of Vermont, where we're actually looking into how these unique dairy fatty acids all together, we know the exact amount that occurs actually in the milk fat, how they actually impact prediabetes. So our hypothesis here is actually that the dairy-derived unique fatty acids prevent the development of diabetes. So take-home message here is it's likely not just one single fatty acid in a dairy fat. It's likely the work in concert of all of these together. And with this one, I'm handing over to Allison, and Allison will be presenting her latest research results where she analyzed the fatty acids in retail milk in the Northeastern U.S.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Unger. I'm currently, as Jana said, a graduate student in Jana's lab. I graduated from the University of Rhode Island with a BS in animal science. And from there, I became very interested in the relationship between not only agriculture, but also the connection with human health. And so that's where I found Jana, and I've had a great time so far. So currently, I'm a PhD candidate in animal nutrition and food sciences through the animal science department at the University of Vermont. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the research that came out of our lab. And this is the product of a paper that was published this past March. And the title of this paper is Fatty Acid Content of Retail Cow's Milk in the Northeastern United States. What's in it for the consumer? Traditionally, the market for U.S. retail milk has been fulfilled with conventionally produced milk. However, currently there is a growing interest for specialty milk and the perceived ability of these milks to promote health and reduce risk of disease. So one type of these specialty milks is organic milk, and this is produced by maximizing dairy livestock's access to and feed intake from pasture. And recently a survey was done which found that about 13% of households in the United States are currently using and consuming organic milk. And the United States is the leading global market for organic dairy products at this time. Another type of specialty milk that has become quite popular in the past few years is grass-fed milk. And this is milk that is also certified organic, but it's produced from forage-only fed cows. And importantly, the diet of these cows has had a complete elimination of grain-based forages. And again, this is a very popular product, type of dairy product, and the market growth is outpacing all other dairy categories right now. And lastly, another type of specialty milk that has some popularity is N3 or omega-3 fatty acids fortified milk. And this is supplemented post-harvest, so after milk has already been collected. Importantly, this is not a dietary strategy for the dairy cow, but once the milk has been collected and brought to the processing plant, it can then be supplemented with typically fish or algal oil. And the idea of how this came about was to enhance the content of the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in milk. For example, EPA and DHA are typically the ones that are added. And this is again because, as Jana mentioned, there's a very low content of polyunsaturated fatty acids within milk due to biohydrogenation. So the idea came about to add them in after the fact as a post-harvest measurement. So what all three types of these specialty milks have in common is that they claim nutritional superiority compared to conventional milk. And as a result, consumers are willing to pay a premium for these milks, sometimes more than double the price per fluid ounce of conventional milk, to buy these types of milks with the idea that they will be more healthful and provide added benefits to them. Importantly, however, there's actually no evidence that consumption of these milks imparts meaningful nutritional health benefits. So this is where our research question came in, and we asked, does the fatty acid profile of organic and N3 fortified milk reflect physiologically meaningful differences compared to conventional milk? To do this, we compared the fatty acid composition and content between three types of retail milk commercially available in retail stores in the Northeast United States. And the three retail labels we chose were conventional, organic, and N3 fortified milk. We also were interested in comparing the effective season on these three different types of milk. And so to do this, we compared the fatty acid composition and content of these three types of milk by what we termed the warm season and the cool season. So we, for our study, assessed 17 different in total retail milk labels. 8 of these were conventional, 6 were organic, and 3 were N3 fortified. And these were used in our study based off of what was available in our local retail stores. And you can see here, looking at all of these logos, there is a nice spread of not only large-scale dairy productions, a lot of them from generic grocery store labels, but there are also some smaller local dairy farms that were used as well. So every month, these 17 retail milk brands were purchased, and they were purchased for analysis every month for an entire year. Milk that was purchased from November through April was termed collected during the cool season, and milk that was purchased from May through October was termed collected from the warm season. And we separated the seasons in this way, or the months in this way, based off of when cows are typically consuming pasture. And we also wanted to make the information more digestible. And so rather than looking at all of the monthly variations, we focused on 2 general patterns that we thought we would see. So in total, purchasing all 17 of these brands for 12 consecutive months led to 204 milk samples altogether. So when milk was purchased, the cream was immediately collected. And from this cream, we were able to isolate the milk fat and prepare the milk fat for fatty acid analysis via gas liquid chromatography. And from this analysis, you can see it separates the fatty acids, and we can identify them from there and determine fatty acid composition of each milk sample. And so from the gas liquid chromatography analysis, we have, again, this fatty acid composition data, what we term gram per 100 grams, but it's really just the percentage of all of the different fatty acids in relation to one another. We then wanted to calculate how this converted into milligrams per serving in an 8-ounce glass or 1 cup of whole milk. And importantly, we chose to analyze the data this way because we really wanted to focus our data through the lens of the consumer and make it as nutritionally relevant as possible. So this is why we chose to show the data in this manner. First, I'm going to show what we found regarding the effect of retail label on the fatty acid composition and content in retail milk. So here we have a diagram of a particular analysis we ran. And what this analysis does is it clusters data points that are more similar to one another, more closely together. And those that are most different from one another will be farther apart from one another. And so each data point is the fatty acid profile or fatty acid composition of a retail milk brand averaged for the entire year of their fatty acid composition. And so in gray, we have conventional milk brands, blue are the organic milk brands, and yellow are the N3 fortified milk brands. So right away, looking at this diagram, we could see pretty clearly that fatty acid composition in milk was influenced by retail label. Specifically, we saw that for the most part, conventional milk brands clustered very closely to one another, signifying that they were very similar to one another. However, there was one brand that was very distinct from all of the other conventional milk brands and also very closely related to organic milk. And when we look back at this milk brand, it actually was interesting to see that this particular dairy farm, while a conventional dairy farm, was actually very focused on pasture feeding as a dietary regime for their dairy cows, although they were not a certified organic dairy. So that similarity in dietary strategy for their dairy cows is most likely why we're seeing that the fatty acid profile of the milk is more similar to the other organic dairy farms. Next, we also saw that for the most part, organic milk brands clustered similarly to one another in respect to the conventional milk brands. However, there was definitely one particular brand that was very distinct from all of the other organic milk brands. And when we looked at this milk brand, it was actually the only grass-fed, the only milk that was obtained from a completely grass-fed dairy. And so this is, again, probably what's driving this visual difference in the fatty acid profile between this organic grass-fed milk and the organic milk, which is most likely supplemented with more grains. And lastly, we saw for the most part that the N3 fortified milk clustered more closely with the organic milk than as compared to the conventional milk. And this makes sense because all of these N3 fortified milk brands that were analyzed were also from organic dairies as well. So that's most likely why they're similar. So next we wanted to see how those differences in fatty acid composition translated into fatty acid content on a milligram per serving basis. So the amount of fatty acids per cup of whole milk. And here I have a table with the major fatty acid classes found within milk. So we have total saturated fatty acids, total monounsaturated fatty acids, and total polyunsaturated fatty acids. And we're looking here at the data separated by retail label. So here is conventional milk brands averaged together. Here is organic milk brands, and then this is N3 fortified milk brands. So first of all, we saw that the total content of saturated fatty acids actually did not differ by retail label. And this was a very interesting result for us, considering how a consumer would perceive the results that we found. Typically, I would think a consumer who is going to purchase organic milk and paying, again, almost double, if not more, for their gallon of organic milk compared to conventional milk, they'd probably be surprised that there's no difference in the content of saturated fatty acids in their milk that they're purchasing. Next, we also saw that the content of polyunsaturated fatty acids was greater in organic milk and N3 fortified milk compared to conventional milk. And this makes sense. Most likely what's happening here is that the cows on the organic and the N3 fortified dairy farms are having more access to pasture. And so this greater content of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the feed is most likely being translated into the milk product. Next, we specifically wanted to look at the content of two polyunsaturated fatty acids, the long-chain EPA and DHA. Again, these are the two fatty acids that are most commonly supplemented into N3 fortified milk brands. And so we wanted to see how the content of these two specifically differed by retail label. And here we have the same, a graph with the same color scheme. So gray is showing conventional milk brands, blue is showing organic milk, and then yellow is showing N3 fortified milk. And you can see right away that the EPA and DHA content per serving of an N3 fortified milk is significantly higher, almost 600% higher in N3 fortified milk compared to conventional milk. And even here, another result you can see is that while there is a slightly higher content of EPA and DHA in the organic milk, you can see that even with a dietary regime consisting significantly of grasses, that EPA and DHA is not changing too significantly as compared to conventional milk. Another index that we were specifically interested in with these retail milks is how the ratio of N6 to N3 fatty acids changed compared to different retail labels. And we're interested in this index because it's very relevant to nutrition. Currently, the average U.S. diet has an N6 to N3 fatty acid ratio of about 17:1. And this is really driven by the high content of omega-6 fatty acids that are now currently being consumed by the average American. However, this high content within the diet or the higher ratio of N6 to N3 fatty acids is clearly linked to a higher amount of inflammation in the body. And this can have detrimental effects on health, significantly increasing risk of developing diseases such as cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. In contrast, the actual ratio of N6 to N3 fatty acids that has been shown to be ideal and protective for health is ranging between 1:1, so matching the content of these total N6 to N3 fatty acids, up to about 5:1 for that ratio. And this diet has shown to be, again, protective with a lower amount of inflammation. And this is really the primary driver, we believe, as to why there's a decreased risk of developing these metabolic diseases. So again, we were particularly interested in this ratio and how it changed by retail label of our milk. So here we have graphed the N6 to N3 fatty acid ratio of these milks. And this dotted red line is just the showing where the 5-to-1 ideal ratio would be sitting on the graph. And so what you can see here is that while organic and N3 fortified milk had a more favorable ratio than conventional milk, organic milk had the lowest N6 to N3 fatty acid ratio out of all three of them. And so this is sitting below that 5-to-1 ratio, and in an ideal, the fatty acids are in an ideal ratio for healthfulness. However, when you look at conventional milk, you can see that the average ratio of N6 to N3 fatty acids is about 6-to-1, and that would be outside of the ideal range. So we were also interested in what we term unique dairy-derived fatty acids, and Jana touched on this earlier, and this is the sum of all of the fatty acids that are really unique to dairy products because they are occurring in dairy products due to ruminal fermentation in the rumen of the dairy cow, but also they're occurring due to synthesis in the mammary gland as well. And so this is the sum of short chain, odd chain, branch chain fatty acids, as well as total CLAs. And what we found here was that organic milk was the richest source of unique dairy-derived fatty acids. This is, again, a significant finding because all of these different classes of fatty acids have been associated with beneficial health properties, whether it be anti-inflammatory properties. They've also been associated with increased membrane fluidity, anti-cancer effects, and anti-obesogenic effects. So this is very significant, and actually, we're really one of the only groups that's really looking at these fatty acids in this manner, grouped together and terming them the unique dairy-derived fatty acids. So this was an exciting result for us. Next, we were interested in how the content of trans fatty acids changed within the different retail labels. So here I have different groups of trans fatty acids by retail label. And if you look at total trans fatty acids, you can see that organic milk had the greatest content of trans fatty acids as compared to conventional milk and also N3 fortified milk. And again, thinking about the saturated fatty acids, this is interesting because this would probably come as a surprise to a consumer. They're going to buy that organic milk, and we've been told by governmental health agencies that trans fatty acids should be reduced in the diet. And so it would be most likely a surprise that the organic milk that they're going out and buying actually has a greater content of trans fatty acids compared to the conventional milk. So next I'm going to discuss what we found regarding effective seasons on the fatty acid composition and content of these three different types of milk. So here again, we see this diagram of this analysis that I did earlier. And this is, again, clustering data points that are more similar to one another, and data points that are less similar and divergent will be farther away from one another. So the color scheme is the same regarding milk brands, but I've additionally separated the fatty acid profiles of each brand into milk collected during the cool season in circular data points, and then milk collected during the warm season in triangular data points. And so what we can see really clearly from this analysis is that conventional milk brands, the fatty acid profile of these milks is not changing very much due to season. And this is most likely because the diet of these dairy cows is not being altered very much going from the cool season to the warm season. However, when you look at organic milk coming from organic dairies, you can see that organic milk during the cool season is very distinct from organic milk being produced during the warm season. And we can speculate that what's driving these differences, again, is the fact that cows are being let out onto pasture during these months. And so there's a drastic change in their diet going from feed indoors to being let out onto pasture and consuming grass outside. Next, we looked at specifically the content of trans fatty acids and how that changed from cool to warm season. And we saw what we expected to see is that the content of trans fatty acids in the milk is increasing in the warm season. This would most likely be because as they're consuming a greater amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids from those pasture grasses, there's actually those polyunsaturated fatty acids would be undergoing biohydrogenation from the rumen microbes. However, from this process, there are actually a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids that are not being completely biohydrogenated. And so there are a lot of these escaped intermediate fatty acids that now have these trans bonds. And so this is most likely what's driving that greater content of trans fatty acids in the milk. Next, we're really interested in, again, looking at the consumer's point of view. And so we wanted to see if the brands that had marketed a certain content of fatty acids in their milk per serving, we wanted to independently measure that and see if the actual content matched the claimed content on the carton of the milk. So we looked at 4 different milk brands. The first milk brand was an organic brand. And actually, this was the only grass-fed milk that we had analyzed as a part of our organic group. And so, brand 01 claimed 3 different types of fatty acid content per serving. The first was that they had marketed that their milk had 25% more total CLA per serving in a glass of whole milk compared to the average conventional milk. So what we did is we averaged all of our conventional milks together to determine an average milligram per serving. And from this, we saw that brand 01 actually exceeded their marketed CLA content, and they had almost double the amount rather than just 25% more. They had almost 100% more CLA. Next, we looked at their claim that brand 01 had 47% more N3 fatty acids per serving. And again, we saw that brand 01 actually exceeded their marketed N3 fatty acid content. And actually, per serving, this brand had almost triple the amount of milligrams per serving of the N3 fatty acids than they had marketed. And lastly, brand 01 claims that their milk had a 1-to-1 N6 to N3 fatty acid ratio. And this would be the ideal fatty acid ratio for an average person to be consuming. And surprisingly, we did see that brand 01 achieved this marketed content at a ratio of 1-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids per serving. Next, we looked at the 3 N3 fortified milk brands. So brand F1 marketed that their milk per serving had 32 milligrams of the long-chain anti-inflammatory fatty acid DHA. However, when we measured the amount of DHA per serving of their milk, we found that on average, brand F1 only had about 27 milligrams per serving, which falls short of DHA, which falls short of their marketed DHA content. Next, we measured the amount of EPA and DHA per serving of F2. F2 marketed that they had 50 milligrams of EPA and DHA in a glass of whole milk. However, when we analyzed their milk, we saw that brand F1 had about 1/10 of the fatty acids of EPA and DHA that they had claimed they had. And lastly, we analyzed brand F3. Brand F3 claimed that their milk had 100 milligrams of the long-chain omega-3s, LNA, EPA, and DHA per serving. However, when we analyzed this, we found that on average, brand F3 had about half of the marketed fatty acid content that they claimed. And actually, when you look at the range of over the entire year of how much LNA and EPA and DHA per serving was in a glass of milk, we see that brand F3 never had the marketed N3 fatty acid content that they had claimed they had. So lastly, we wanted to contextualize our results into current dietary guidelines. And so to do this, we asked how fatty acid intake from 3 servings a day of whole retail milk compared to dietary recommendations. To do this, we pulled the recommended maximum intake that were reported for 4 dietary guidelines. 2 of them were national dietary guidelines, the American Heart Association, and dietary guidelines for Americans. And then 2 recommendations were international. One was the Canada's Food Guide, and the other was the World Health Organization. And so altogether, the most classes that these dietary guidelines had listed were very large classes of saturated fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids, and trans fatty acids. So these are the guidelines that we use to measure the fatty acid intake from our milk. And then from here, we have our 3 retail milk brands. And what we did was we multiplied the fatty acid content, for example, of saturated fat by 3 to extrapolate our fatty acid content and project a hypothetical intake of saturated fatty acids, in 3 daily servings of milk. So first, what we saw right away was that regardless of retail label, when assessing the differences in fatty acids consumed in 3 daily servings of milk, looking at these large fatty acid classes listed by recommendations, we actually see very minimal differences between all 3 of these milks. And so what's likely happening here is that the dietary recommendations from these guidelines are most likely too broad and too general to really capture all of the differences between the smaller fatty acid classes and all of the differences between these 3 retail labels. Next, we looked at how saturated fatty acid intake of 3 daily servings of milk compared to the American Heart Association. And these are in general more stringent guidelines compared to the other 3. And from this, we found that projected saturated fatty acid intake from 3 daily servings of whole milk would exceed the recommended intake from the American Heart Association by about 15 to 38%. However, when you look at the dietary guidelines for Americans, as well as the 2 international dietary guidelines, we see that 3 daily servings of whole milk would provide approximately 70% of the recommended intake of saturated fatty acids recommended by these organizations. So in this case, saturated fatty acid intake would be well below the recommended amount, the recommended maximum amount. And next, we focus on projected intake of trans fatty acids and how they compare to dietary guidelines. Actually, we found that only the 2 international dietary guidelines had listed maximum recommended intake for trans fatty acids. And so when we compared 3 daily servings of whole milk to these guidelines, we found that projected trans fatty acid intake would provide less than half of the maximum intake recommended by these 2 guidelines. Another takeaway that we had from looking at our data in that manner is that for the most part, we came to the conclusion that current dietary recommendations are maybe too broad and too simplistic to really capture the differences in potential health benefits of these three different retail milks. And this is because most likely the recommendations are pulling from data that is still outdated and not really looking at current data in the lens that they should be. And so, for example, we recently published a paper examining the saturated fatty acids in dairy and their potential health benefits. And there are all of these minor saturated fatty acid classes within total saturated fatty acids that have been shown to have beneficial health effects, potentially, when consumed. And so overall, it's possible that assessing disease risk for a particular individual based off of simply looking at how much saturated fat in total they're eating is not necessarily the accurate way to be assessing disease risk. Instead, we need to be looking at not only total saturated fatty acids, but also the types of fats that are being eaten, the types of foods that they're being eaten as an avenue for, and also overall dietary and lifestyle patterns of an individual. So overall, we assessed the effects of retail label on the fatty acid content of three different types of milk. And we saw that compared to conventional milk, N3 fortified whole milk had a greater content per serving of N3 fatty acids. We saw that organic milk similarly had an increased N3 fatty acid content compared to conventional milk, but it was also marked by a greater content of unique fatty acids, as well as a greater content of trans fatty acids per serving. And so from this, we concluded that organic milk has a unique fatty acid profile when compared to conventional and N3 fortified milk. Next, we looked at the effects of season on these types of milk. And we saw that seasonal variation was greater in organic and N3 fortified milk compared to conventional milk. Next, we then compared the marketed content of fatty acids from retail brands and compared them to actual content that we measured independently. And we saw that N3 fortified milk brands rarely contained the specified quantity of supplemented fatty acids on the retail label that they had claimed. And also we saw that milk produced from a dairy herd primarily fed grass is a promising strategy for producing milk with a higher content of health beneficial fatty acids. And lastly, we looked at how whole milk from three different retail labels, when extrapolated to 3 servings a day, how that compared to the current dietary recommendations nationally and internationally. And we saw overall that consuming 3 daily servings of whole milk, regardless of retail label, would be well below recommended fat intake according to the majority of dietary recommendations. And also currently that dietary recommendations may be too simplistic and too broad to capture all of the differences between these 3 different types of retail labeled milk. So in conclusion, based off of current recommendations, we found that regardless of retail label, 3 daily servings of whole milk can fit into a balanced, healthy eating pattern. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to me. This was also my first webinar. And here you can see all of the pictures of our lab group, Jana's lab. And I'd like to thank all of them and the department. They've been a huge support system for me. Please, if you're interested, follow me and also follow our lab. We're avid tweeters, and we'll follow you back. And I'd just like to thank you for listening. And yeah, we'll answer any questions at this time.
So first question is, are all dairy product fats, especially the cultured dairy products, the same, especially after the rumen microbes explanation? So in other words, is the content of all the different dairy products of the type of fatty acids the same?
So it's an interesting question about the fermented products, but first, in general, if you're just extracting the fatty acids from your product, doesn't matter if it's the cheese or the yogurt or the milk, the fatty acids usually are, the same. But of course, it depends on, where has the cow been fed, what type of breed the cow is, in, parity, lactation stage, which also goes back a little bit on feed. So that's where really, the variation in fatty acids comes in, but it's less the product. The only difference here is, of course, the fat content, depending upon what you're eating, like the more fat content you have, the higher the content of the fatty acids are. So in terms of the fermented products, this is a really interesting question, actually. So first of all, there is not as much out there. There was a publication out, I think about in 2015, where they looked at different kefir products, and they looked at fatty acid compositions, and they did find differences between certain fatty acids like palmitic acid, which is 16O, that was, I believe, higher in the fermented products. And they also saw slight differences in, over storage. But I think overall, these differences are still minute. When you think about this, fermented products, they have usually just a few cultures. They have basically lactobacillus, they have bifidobacterium, so there are just a few. And when you look at the rumen, not only do you have like different species, but you have a lot of different bacteria there as well, and they work in concert. So you would expect much less change in the fatty acid profile in your final product as opposed to in the cow.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Here's an interesting question. Might the breed of the dairy cow make a difference in the fatty acid profile of the milk as well as the diet?
Yeah, absolutely. It really depends. We actually had a smaller study where we looked at Jersey cows and Holstein cows, and then we actually had a crossbreed of them, and there are differences in the fatty acid profile because they have, each cow, while of course they have the rumen and the bacteria are making, part of the fatty acids that end up in the milk, but there are also the tissues and, the mammary gland and their, enzymes in the mammary gland, they also contribute to different amounts of fatty acids in the milk. And it's been shown that for example, Jersey, they have a slightly higher saturated fatty acid content than Holstein. So there are differences, but they are not major. And I saw a question, Alice, if I might jump ahead, but it's kind of along with that. There was a question about goat milk, and overall, there are actually rumens as well, of course. So the average fatty acid composition, saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, is very similar there across the board. But you do see differences within these groups. For example, goat's milk has much more caprylic and caprylic acid. So these are fatty acids with 8 and 10 carbon chains, and that's where also the name comes from, because capros is the goat. So they have much more of that. But then they have less of other fatty acids such as palmitic acid and stearic acid. But so it's the distribution is different within, but the major fatty acid classes are very similar between goat and cows.
Okay. Did you compare DPA in the retail study? And if so, how did the brands compare?
So we didn't focus on DPA. It was measured in our milk. It wasn't reported necessarily individually, in the paper. However, I would imagine off the top of my head, it mirrored closely with the pattern we see with the other long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, with conventional milk most likely having the lowest and organic milk having slightly more due to the high pasture content they're eating. But I would expect that the N3 fortified milk brands had significantly higher amounts because they're being, again, supplemented with those algal and fish oils.
Okay. Somebody was interested in knowing what the funding sources were for this research. I thought that part of it at least was funded by NIFA OREI, but I'm not sure.
Yes. So actually, Allison's paper was funded through my startup. That research idea was actually born at one of the organic conferences that I think it was the winter conference at UVM. And I had the idea to compare these different products, and I used my startup money for my research for that. But some of the money also comes from basically USDA. They basically pay for preliminary small studies like that.
Okay, let's see. Are the trans fatty acids produced in the rumen all trans for a specific chain or just some proportion?
I hope I understand this question correct. So there are different trans fatty acids in ruminant products. They all have in common that they have the same length of the chain. It's 18 carbons long, so they're all the same. But the trans bond, sometimes they have 2 double bonds, and most of the times they have 1 double bond. And the ones with the 18 carbons and the 1 double bond, the trans double bond is actually at different positions within the fatty acid molecule. So, you know, they are quite different. And in ruminant products, we find at least 20-25% different types of trans fatty acids. But the profile is not comparable to partially hydrogenated vegetable oil.
Okay, let's see. We have some interesting questions about the fatty acid ratios. Are you familiar with the BBC or Bleu Blanc Coeur project in the EU? It's building a market around targeting these ideal ratios with the resultant animal products such as dairy, eggs, etc., from enrolled farms. I think this makes more sense than process-based labels that may not necessarily hit these ideal ratio targets.
I think the question, or what they are doing is they're looking at feeding flaxseed and linseed oil, or products to animals, and thereby increasing the amount of omega-3 fatty acids in a product. And so I'm familiar thus far that I know what they are doing. But I have to say, increasing the omega-3 content, and specifically if you're using flaxseed or linseed, it's linoleic acid, so that's a fatty acid with 18 carbons and 3 double bonds. It works best in non-ruminants, like you basically feed it, and what you feed you also see in the animal product. It's much harder, with ruminants, because you have the rumen and the microbiota. And as I told you before, it's really hard to get enough polyunsaturated fatty acids into the milk, because they basically convert those to saturated fatty acids. There are some studies from Andre Brito and his group. They were feeding flaxseed oil, extruded flaxseed and ground flaxseed to cows on organic dairies. I think the idea was here that they were feeding this during the winter time to maintain the omega-3 content in milk. And I think they were quite successful. What they were doing there, they at least maintained the amount of omega-3 fatty acids in milk. Was quite comparable to the summer milk, but again, it's hard to get the omega-3 fatty acids in the product if you're doing this through feeding strategies. It's not easy because of the rumen of the cow.
Okay, here's a comment from somebody. It looks as though she may have left the webinar, but she wanted to point out why a consumer should still choose organic even if the nutritional content isn't drastically different, because the significant difference in the welfare of the livestock and the positive environmental effects are very important as well. So that was a good comment there. Not exactly a question, but if you have any thoughts on that. Okay. Let's see. Here's another question. Aren't you assuming that 3 glasses of milk would be the only fatty acids consumed per day when you state that 3 glasses would easily meet the recommended daily allowance? Few Americans are consuming only milk as their fatty acids per day.
Yeah, so we were, for what we showed for this presentation, very importantly, yes, we are only looking at the fat intake derived from 3 servings per day. What we were really, the point that we were really trying to drive with that table, not really meaning to mislead anyone, but really trying to speak to the misconception that, again, kind of touching back on what Jana was speaking about earlier, that milk is 100% fat and 70% of that is saturated fat. So we wanted to contextualize it and just show that consuming 3 servings a day would be well below recommended fat intake. But importantly, we also want to emphasize that the recommended fat intake from these dietary guidelines may not necessarily be in line with the current work that's coming out, showing that it's not just about total fatty acid consumption as a way to determine disease risk.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
That's the original intent, recommending that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, did you compare the seasonal differences of fatty acid within the totally grass-fed milk, and was it large?
So that's a good question. We actually, at the time that this milk was collected, there was only one brand of grass-fed milk available locally. So we only had one grass-fed brand as a part of the organic brands because we couldn't really make it its own group. So we didn't assess it separately. However, that is a really important next step that would that somebody definitely should look into now that there are more grass-fed brands that are out on the market. It would be interesting to see how their fatty acid profiles compared with the ones that we analyzed.
Okay. Okay, this is a question for Allison. This person would like to ask, what metric should be used to value the anti-inflammatory properties of organic versus conventional milks?
Yeah, so for this presentation, I specifically talked about the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratios in milk. So there are other indices that you can look at for potential health benefits or anti-inflammatory properties. But this is the key one that we use just because it's so well known for consumers.
Okay, let's see. Can you generalize and say a certain breed of cow is used with commercial dairy here in the U.S.?
No. No.
Okay. How do you determine what some consumer demographics, for example, those who buy organic milk, would be wanting? I assume in terms of fatty acid content.
Yeah, so what we see right now on the market kind of speaks to that. Consumers are definitely, in general, interested in the content of omega-3 fatty acids. Those are definitely well known, and they are purported to have beneficial health effects. And we've also seen the same thing with CLA content, because that was because of the anti-obesogenic effects that they have been shown to have, and also I would say probably the other main one would be the omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio. But there are also, again, those long-chain omega-3 fatty acids like EPA and DHA that are in fish oil that consumers, you know, should they not like fish or maybe they're allergic to it, they'll seek elsewhere. So the N3 fortified milk brands really came about to fill that gap as well.
Okay, well, I think we've gotten through the questions here. So I'd like to thank everyone for these great questions. Thank you so much, Jana and Allison, for presenting this webinar, and for everyone for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for attending.
Yes, thank you.